Out of the way! Who is wasting my fucking time?
Wretches won't dig.
Don Spadaro, Federico's crew has not returned from the new deposit. Something's not right.
So sorry to hear that. I'll remember to say a prayer for them.
Being feared and being respected are not the same thing, and Ruggero Spadaro embodies that contradiction in full. He commanded power, yes. He enforced omerta, yes. He wore the title of Don, a name that by itself demanded deference. But true honor is not measured by how many men dare not cross you. It's measured in how you treat those beneath you, by the values you uphold when no one is watching, and by whether your word carries weight outside the violence you control. Spadaro's reputation for cruelty, for exploiting the weak, for tightening his grip on Sicily's mines and bleeding workers dry, stands in direct opposition to the idea of him being respected, and the sense of Luca implies, as we've discussed in Luca's video. More likely, Luca's words were a reflection of necessity, not admiration. Ruggero was dangerous enough that even the Torrisi family had to acknowledge him carefully, dressing their words in ritual and ceremonies showing a politeness born out of the desire to just keep the peace. Because in the world they all inhabited, fear has a way of disguising itself as respect, or even just a willingness to avoid all-out bloodshed. So when we ask if Ruggero Spadaro was truly honorable, the answer is almost certainly no, not in any moral sense. His brand of honor was the kind defined strictly within the walls of the Mafia: loyalty to silence, the readiness to kill without hesitation, and the strength to dominate anyone who stood in his way. Beyond that insular code, to those who lived outside of it, Ruggero was less a man to be admired and more a predator wrapped in tradition. A predator who may have broken with genuine ceremony a long time ago, replacing it with the empty trappings of power. And it was that pursuit of power, not principle, that defined Spadaro's true empire. Not in the rituals of honor, not even in war, but in sulfur. In the mines that broke the backs of men and children, where his cruelty was not just a weapon, it was a business model. Spadaro's entry into the story is unlike anyone else's, because we're given something incredibly rare, a first-hand account of how he's viewed by the Curuso of the time. From the very beginning, the picture is far from flattering. To them, he's a man who cared little for their safety, someone who treated human lives as expendable next to the profits of his ventures. His reputation was built purely on how ruthlessly he conducted business and the lengths he would go to stretch every dollar as far as possible. Profit above all else. That ethos defined his role more than anything else. But before we can fully understand the cruelty of his leadership, we need to step back and see how Spadaro came into this region of Sicily to begin with, because his rise was not born out of destiny or careful planning, but purely out of convenience for the Baron. You see, when Baron Fontanella's father passed away, the younger Fontanella inherited a sprawling set of properties, including the sulfur mine in Collesolfo. Yet the Baron cared little for these lands. The mine, though the only real source of income, in addition to the factory out in Collesolfo, was treated almost entirely as a nuisance. He preferred the luxuries of Palermo over any responsibility to the workers who labored under his name. So in his absence, the Torrisi family, who had managed Fontanella's holdings for many years at that point, were allowed to continue carrying on the arrangements his father had long established. Don Torrisi himself may have expected that the stewardship would eventually evolve into full influence over all of the properties, which of course would have meant taking over the mine once the elder Baron had passed away. It does generate a little bit of a question of, can we really fault Don Torrisi if he believed that to be the right move? After all, he was taking care of the rest of this land that was all under the Fontanella's name. While we lack any hard proof of this, a remark he made years later hints at it. In what seemed almost as a throwaway reflection, Torrisi once admitted that the entire conflict with the Spadaros that would eventually erupt between both families might have been avoided had the elder Baron lived a few years longer.
This whole thing started about 20 years ago. Back then, we were a smaller outfit. We worked for Fontanella's father, protecting his properties, collecting rent, that kind of thing.
The older Fontanella. That was some kind of man. If he had lived a few years longer, this whole thing might have been avoided.
The old man died suddenly.
Whether that was regret, foresight, or bitter irony, it reveals how fragile the balance had always been. But instead of handling the Colozolfo mine over to the Torrisi family, Baron Fontanella made a different choice. He sold half of his shares to outside business partners, who brought in their own men to run operations. Those men were Don Spadaro and his associate, Massimo Bastoni, the father of Leombra and Il Merlo. Now, the reason why the Baron might have went with this decision rather than handling it over to the Torrisi family could have been because it might have just seemed more practical, based off where Spadaro came from. He hailed from the province of Agrigento, and with that came experience from a region historically famous for its sulfur industry. At the time, Agrigento was one of the central hubs of mining in Sicily, its wealth tied to a resource exported across the entire globe. And to oversimplify what was in truth a complex trade, sulfur was the foundational ingredient in gunpowder, among many other uses at the time, and hence its demand stretched far beyond Italy's borders. There was, of course, immense wealth to be made from sulfur, but that fortune came at a staggering human cost. Behind the numbers and exports lay a much darker reality to this business. The mines were brutal, unforgiving places where men and children labored under conditions that bordered on slavery. In fact, many of them were, and every day carried the threat of death. Tunnel cave-ins, heat exhaustion, toxic fumes, and endless shifts that stretched 8 to 10 hours at a time were all things they had to deal with non-stop. And these sulfur carriers were also expected to meet strict daily quotas, hauling load after load from the suffocating depths of the mines to the surface above. Each sack of sulfur weighed anywhere from 55 to nearly 176 pounds, crushing burdens that bent their spines and broke their bodies. The weight was not adjusted for mercy, but only age. Adults and teenagers bore the heaviest loads, while even children, some as young as 5 years old, were forced to carry smaller but still punishing bundles. They were the ones that typically carried the lower end 55-pound sacks. And for all of this suffering, for all of the immense amount of wealth to be earned here, the pay for the workers themselves was meager. The Caruso earned wages so low they could barely keep themselves alive, let alone their families if they had any. And those that were sold off as children to pay off their families' debts, as Enzo was damn near impossible. The combination of being overworked in such a dangerous environment for such little pay all but guaranteed that the Caruso lived in a cycle of exhaustion and exploitation. Their lives were reduced to labor while their futures were consumed by the mines. We know that 1896 was the year the war between the Spadaro and Torrisi families erupted, because the game's artwork explicitly cites that date. And thanks to Don Torrisi's own words, we also know that by the time open conflict began, it had already been years in the making. This detail matters, because it helps us place Spadaro's takeover of the Colizolfo mine and his rise in the region firmly in the late 1880s to early 1890s. Luca's recounting of the 1890s further supports this timeline, with the Torrisi family's activities during that decade centered heavily on breaking up labor union strikes. This overall period is important for another reason as well. It was also the height of Sicily's sulfur mining industry. Profit margins were at their peak, precisely because the trade remained so unindustrialized compared to other global markets. Mines across Sicily still relied on outdated methods that kept costs low and, of course, human suffering high. And unlike other parts of the world, nearly all of the island's natural resource trades, from citrus production to tuna fishing and to sulfur, were under the monopoly of criminal gangs. They controlled the profits, and they enforced that control with violence. That was the other side of Spadaro's background. Connections and dealings Fontanella may never have fully grasped, or perhaps chose not to. Whether through ignorance or convenience, he looked the other way. By refusing to confront what lay beneath the surface, Fontanella kept himself blind to the full cost of the mine's operation and to the people who were really running it. I chose to skip the Torrisi-Spadaro War for now, because I believe both the original conflict and what we see later in the game stem from the same place. Spadaro's hunger for expansion and Fontanella's willingness to let others hash it out until it became too much of a problem for them and, more importantly, for him. Instead, I'm focusing on Don Spadaro's foundation of power and his exploitation of Fontanella, because that story is more detailed and frankly much more complex. We don't get every step laid out for us, but the game gives us just enough to see how much Fontanella was used by Spadaro. If we take the Torrisi family out of the picture as a whole, for instance, much of the story still revolves around Fontanella's properties. Spadaro even muscled in on some of it, possibly without Fontanella's knowledge. and how much of a problem this became is revealed through in-game collectibles. A newspaper dated July 12, 1904 shows us the behind-the-scenes struggle of the mine and the positions each man who have a say within the mine's operations were all taking. By this point, it was well past the boom of the sulfur industry, and years after Spadaro had secured control of the region without any concern of Torrisi interference. The cracks in the mine's stability were becoming impossible to ignore. Fontanella's partner, Ludovici, pushed aggressively for expansion. He wanted modernization, new methods, and greater output as a direct response to the collapsing global demand for Sicilian sulfur. Fontanella, on the other hand, grounded all progress. He resisted expansion, resisted modernization, and stalled every effort to increase profit margins or prepare for inevitable collapse. On paper, he framed this resistance as a matter of principle. He pointed to the laborers' suffering, to the damage inflicted on the region itself, and by then, Colazolfo was already shrouded in a near-permanent haze. Even its rivers were poisoned with runoff from the toxic fumes and deeper tunnels that were being engineered seemingly every single day. But I doubt Fontanella was as ignorant as the newspaper makes him sound, because either he never visited the region, expansion had been happening gradually without his awareness, or most likely he simply did not want the responsibility, and receiving blame for how these laborers are being treated and the potential permanent effects on the land. His resistance, whatever the reason, caused problems that would ripple all throughout the mine's hierarchy though. His heated arguments with Ludovici grew so bad that they began to rattle investor confidence. Doubts spread not only about how long the mine's profitability could last, but whether Fontanella and Ludovici's differences might destabilize the company as a whole. Around the same period, Fontanella was appearing to have taken a greater interest in the day-to-day operations, looking closely at how Don Spadaro was running the mine. That forced Spadaro into damage control. In a letter to Ignacio, the camp's cook, or more accurately, the man responsible for rationing meals, Spadaro orders him to start trimming some fat around here and cover up some holes. He orders Ignacio to start cutting down meal portions, stretch the food supply, and make sure deliveries only needed to arrive once a week. And if laborers dared complain, Spadaro's solution was blunt. Let El Merlo handle it. In a second letter, received from the board of directors just a few days after the newspaper was published, we see the added length of Spadaro's damage control. In it, he apparently requested higher quality tools to increase the mine's efficiency, but the request is denied, on the grounds that supplying the entire Colazolfo mine with new equipment was judged too costly given the mine's scale. Instead, the board suggested a cheaper alternative: artificially boost short-term output by opening new shafts and expanding operational hours. Spadaro embraced this immediately. No additional pay was offered to the laborers, who were simply ordered onto longer shifts. Their new duties included clearing collapsed tunnels and digging fresh pathways forward on top of the same exhausting work they already carried. His complete disregard for the Carusu in the beginning of the game is obvious in this period. Men went missing, tremors shook the mine, the threat of collapse only grew. Spadaro's response to this was sarcasm, claiming he would remember to pray for them. His request for better equipment had never been sincere. It was most likely a calculated move made at a time when he knew it would be denied. With sulfur demand falling and profits slowing, Spadaro wanted expansion, but without directly challenging Fontanella's resistance. By making a hollow request and letting the board predictably shut it down, he could point to their denial as justification. The board's recommendation gave him exactly what he wanted: cover to push longer hours, dig deeper tunnels, and force the mine past every warning sign. And if Fontanella questioned it or pushed back, he can fall back on that letter. This wouldn't be the only time Spadaro made calculated moves against Fontanella, though it may be the only one that could be called passive. Both Spadaro and Fontanella's partner Ludovici favored expansion. Both wanted profits maintained, no matter the human suffering or the destruction of the land, eventually reaching their breaking point just a year later, when the two of them conspired together to launch a kidnapping of Gennaro, Fontanella's son. The plan was pretty straightforward: kidnap him and force Fontanella to relinquish his remaining share of the mine. What makes this kidnapping unique is that Spadaro doesn't appear to have directly organized it. The plot itself belonged to Ludovici, carried out by a bandit named Messina, but Spadaro's hand is still present. He provided security for Ludovici, ensuring protection against any response from Torrisi, who became involved only after his daughter Isabella was accidentally caught in the middle of the abduction. Even Messina himself was uneasy about how far that had gone, thanks to Isabella's unexpected presence. But for Spadaro, it was simply another way to tighten the noose around Fontanella, this time not by rationing meals or hiding behind the board, but by aligning with his business partner to strike directly at his family. For Torrisi, the kidnapping was still a contained matter. He openly admitted he had no business in Colizolfo, how the mine was run, or what was happening behind the scenes between its stakeholders. His only concern was that his daughter Isabella had been dragged into it, and someone had to pay. At the time, a truce was still in place between the families. Spadaro's men didn't directly touch Isabella, nor was Spadaro named as the man behind the plot, so it wasn't a direct attack from one family to the other. That made Ludovici the obvious target, and a safe example to remind everyone of the boundaries between both these families, with the Torrisi name and reputation in particular being one to not trifle with. But this does leave a larger question. If Ludovici was known to have planned the kidnapping, and if Spadaro had openly provided protection for his villa after it had proven to be a failure and Messina was killed, why was Fontanella still working with Spadaro? The answer reveals something few acknowledged about Don Spadaro. For all of his power, for all of his reputation as a feared Don, he never actually had a stake in the mine. He could run the operations, he could keep the Caruso in line, he could bleed Colizolfo dry for as long as he wanted, but legally, the mine never belonged to him. His authority existed only through Fontanella's negligence and Ludovici's partnership. In truth, Spadaro was not an owner, but someone clinging to the margins of ownership, feared in practice, undermined in principle. And that's the very reason why he ends up tricking Fontanella to betray Don Torrisi at the end of the game. Because with Fontanella signing over the rights, Spadaro would finally have what he had always lacked: legal, genuine ownership, genuine staying power in the region. And beyond legitimacy, there was the added insult. The property he stood to gain included the very land Torrisi's own vineyard was situated on. For Spadaro, it would not only cement his control of Colizolfo, it would humiliate the man he had long lived in the shadow of. In a protection agreement letter to Massimo, Spadaro shows a level of respect not seen even with Don Torrisi. His personality throughout the game is built on intimidation, few words, a permanent scowl, and the reputation of violence carried by the men underneath him. That was his language, and it carried him through nearly every single interaction. But in this letter, Spadaro bends in a way that is uncharacteristic of him. He makes sure to ask if it's acceptable to address Massimo by his first name. He admits the mistake of bringing Torrisi into the affair, something Torrisi himself had never cared about, even making it personal. And out of fear of retaliation, he promises protection. Spadaro dispatches men to guard Massimo and his property, and Torrisi is dealt with. The deal he offers reveals everything about where Spadaro truly stood. In exchange for his protection, when Fontanella signs over the final rights to the mine, Massimo would then relinquish half of those rights to Spadaro. The letter is signed off with words that almost sound desperate, as his future business partner. If Spadaro ever had a singular goal, it was this: securing his place in the region as a recognized power, someone on equal footing with Massimo and the other men whose influence carried both fear and respect. Respect, after all, was one thing Fontanella would never command, and Spadaro was more than willing to exploit that weakness. Fontanella's ignorance left the door wide open, and Spadaro stepped through it without wasting any more opportunities. And he might have succeeded had he not allowed himself to get blindsided by a repeat of what happened in 1896. Even without the exact details of that war, the broader picture tells us plenty. By then, the mine was profitable, Fontanella had little interest in the region, and both his position and the mine's stability were secure in the years that followed. Luca will later explain that the tragic death of Michele Galante, along with his wife and 2 children in a house fire, was enough to bring Spadaro to the negotiating table and end the First War. In Luca's retelling, Spadaro came across as honorable, someone who recognized the weight of Michele's loss, a man respected enough that even his enemies would pause. But more likely, Luca misunderstood. Spadaro wasn't moved by respect or honor, he was boxed in. The fire threatened the stability of everyone's business interests, and with pressure mounting from his own superiors and rivals alike, he had little choice but to yield. That would explain why we later see Fontanella appearing to Don Torrisi in 1907, practically begging for the war to end because, yet again, it's threatening business in the overall stability. In the earlier conflict of 1896, the Spadaros were newcomers, disruptive to the existing balance of power, and more likely to be blamed for prolonging violence when the mine itself was already lucrative enough without the need for war. It's easy to imagine Spadaro being pressed not just by Fontanella, but by every party invested in stability in the region, perhaps even threatened with removal from the region if he refused to yield. That pressure, not respect, may have been what truly brought him to the negotiating table. But by 1907, Spadaro had clearly learned from those earlier lessons. He dressed his final maneuvers in the guise of reason, presenting himself as willing to negotiate respectably, while at the same time pursuing actions Don Torrisi would never abide by. Whether or not Leombra working with the law was something Spadaro was aware of remains uncertain. But what feels more believable is that Spadaro himself gave Il Merlo the green light to strike on the Saint's Day, violating a sacred moment of respect and forcing the conflict to a bloody head. The death of Il Merlo was the price Spadaro had to pay for breaking their fragile treaty, and that insult cut deep. It could have been the very reason why he was driven to pursue something far more personal, pressuring Fontanella to sell him the Torrisi vineyard outright. But the vineyard was only part of a larger play. The attack in San Celesti, followed by the prefix call from Rome to crack down on Mafia activity in the region, gave Spadaro the perfect cover. He could posture as the more reasonable of the two, presenting himself as a man of business, all too willing to cut ties with Torrisi in a dignified, seemingly respectable manner. On the surface, this was the point of the final sit-down, an alleged business arrangement to bring stability and end the bloodshed, yet that was never Spadaro's intention. His true aim was to gather his enemies in one place and wipe them out in one single stroke, with the rights of everything signed over before the killing blow. What he hadn't counted on was Fontanella. While Spadaro was ready to strike, Fontanella hesitated, dragging his feet over the signatures, and when the moment came, instead of committing to the plan, Fontanella chose to bask in the comfort at an opera. Spadaro knew he already played his hand, and to relent now was far too dangerous. They had to stomp Torrisi out. But Fontanella's cold feet unraveled everything. Now I would say, given Fontanella's suggestion of exploring other alternatives and other plans, reveals that after the fact he was aware that he messed up, that he bought into whatever lie Spadaro had given him, and after he had made that commitment, he had no choice but to align himself with the Spadaro crime family over Torrisi, because that line had already been crossed. This all should have resulted in Spadaro's final triumph, but it turned into his undoing, his ambitions undone not solely by his enemies, but by the very ally whose ignorance he had counted on from the very start. Spadaro's rise lay in the same person who caused his fall, with power, greed, and refusal to let things go with the Torrisi crime family, only making everything much worse. Thank you for sticking around to the very end. It really does mean a lot. I'm curious what you think about Luca Trapani, his position within the Torrisi crime family, and how things might have been differently had he survived. I do have another video coming out specifically on his death, but I do want to wait on major spoilers for the game right now. So subscribe for some future Mafia content, for analysis, breakdowns, and overall backstories. And a major shout out to my patrons, Daniel Homan, Konkin, and Ryan Smith. It's thanks to you that I'm able to spend so much time and go as detailed in these videos as possible. If you want to support the channel directly as well and get some behind the scenes or exclusive content on myself, the channel overall, and just how these videos are put together, then consider checking out the Patreon. Link is down in the pinned comment.